Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, sitting at a dinner table, you're with 12 of your absolute closest friends.
Okay.
The food is out, the conversation is flowing, everyone's having a good time, but you possess this absolute irrefutable time-traveling proof that by tomorrow morning, one of the guys sitting there laughing at your jokes is going to sell you out to the police for like a handful of silver.
Wow. Yeah, that's dark.
Right. And it gets worse. Another guy, the one who is usually the loudest, the most loyal of the bunch, he's going to violently swear he has never even met you.
Yeah.
The rest of them, they're all just going to scatter into the dark, completely abandoning you to face this horrific execution all by yourself.
Just totally alone.
Exactly. So the question is, do you pass them the bread? Do you get up and wash their feet? Or do you just stand up, push your chair back, and walk out of the room?
I mean, it is an almost impossible scenario to even wrap our human minds around, really. Because human affection, by its very nature, it's built on a framework of reciprocity. Like, we love conditionally.
We do. And, we might not want to admit it. We might dress it up in all this noble language. But at the end of the day, our love is usually a contract.
Right.
You invest in a relationship, the other person invests back, and, well, it functions.
Yeah, exactly.
But the moment you are betrayed or even just chronically misunderstood or just completely exhausted by someone's like continuous repeated failures, that affection starts to retreat. We start building walls. We withdraw.
Because human love has a breaking point. It's inherently fragile.
Yeah.
We love until we are given a really compelling reason not to. And the reason this matters so much for this deep dive today is that this exact human tendency is the root of a massive paralyzing anxiety for so many of you listening right now.
Absolutely.
Because we subconsciously project that exact same fragile, conditional, sort of transactional framework right onto God.
We do it all the time
Sure.
because we know ourselves, right? You know your own lingering weaknesses. You know the sins you promised you would, like never commit again. And yet there you were last Tuesday doing the exact same thing.
Right.
And there is this secret, really terrifying fear that Christ operates the same way we do. We suspect that our spiritual frailty, our chronic stumbling, is eventually going to just exhaust his patience.
Yeah, we think, sure, his grace was amazing and sufficient to save us at the very beginning, but...
But surely at some point, he's going to look at our track record, throw up his hands, and just say, I am done with this person. They are just way too much work.
Which is precisely why our mission today is so critical. We're going to unpack a single monumental verse of Scripture. That's John chapter 13, verse 1. And our goal is to show you how this one verse is the ultimate definitive shattering of that exact fear. We're going to be interacting heavily with Dane Ortlund's really profound exploration of this passage, specifically looking at the unfailing heart of Christ for sinners and sufferers. But we're also going to layer in some incredibly rich historical literary and theological analysis to really ground this whole thing.
So if you are listening to this and you feel like you're on thin ice with God, or, if you feel like your failures have pushed you to the absolute limit of his grace, this deep dive is definitely for you. Because what we're going to discover is that Christ's love is not a temporary mood.
No,
it's not a vague, sentimental feeling that just evaporates when you mess up. It is an immutable, unending trajectory.
But to truly grasp the weight of this love, though, we can't just look at the words on a page like we're dissecting a sterile theological theorem in some laboratory. Context is absolutely everything.
Right.
We have to step out of our modern comfort and step directly into the explosive historical powder keg where these events actually took place.
Okay, so set the scene for us. Where exactly are we, and what is the temperature in the room?
Okay, so we are in Jerusalem. The year is somewhere between 80, 30, and 33. And to call the atmosphere in the city tense would be the understatement of the century.
I can imagine.
It is an absolute historical crucible. First off, you have a city and a nation under the iron fist of Roman occupational tyranny. You have Pontius Pilate, a brutal Roman governor who is known for his ruthless suppression of any hint of rebellion, just overseeing the entire region.
Just waiting for someone to step out of line.
Exactly. He has Roman garrisons stationed in the Antonia fortress, literally looking down over the Jewish temple courts, ready to just slaughter anyone who causes trouble.
So there's this constant, suffocating military presence, just heavily armed foreign soldiers patrolling all your sacred spaces.
Exactly. But the oppression isn't just coming from Rome. The internal religious and civic life of the city is managed by a deeply corrupt, aristocratic Jewish establishment, and this is led by the high priest, Caiaphas.
Right, Caiaphas.
This is essentially a religious mafia. They are collaborating with Rome to maintain their own wealth and their own power. They control the temple economy, they control the courts, and they view any kind of grassroots religious movement as a direct threat to their comfortable little arrangement with the empire.
And if I remember the timeline correctly, this isn't just like a random Tuesday in Jerusalem. This is the week of Passover.
Yes. And that changes the entire dynamic of the city.
Yeah.
Jerusalem's normal population might have been around, say, 50,000 to 80,000 people. But during Passover, hundreds of thousands of Jewish pilgrims travel from all over the Greco-Roman world to just pack into the city.
Wow.
Every inn is full. Tents are set up all over the surrounding hillsides. The city is practically bursting at the seams.
So you have massive overcrowding combined with the fact that Passover is literally a festival celebrating national liberation. Like, they are actively remembering how God crushed the empire of Egypt to set them free. I have to imagine the air is just thick with messianic fever and civil unrest. The people are desperate for a new Moses or a new David, like a military conqueror who will shatter the Roman yoke right then and there.
You've hit the nail on the head. The Romans are on extremely high alert for riots. The religious leaders are terrified of losing their status, and the crowds are just buzzing with revolutionary energy. But that Passover setting is not just a calendar marker or a political backdrop. It is a massive, redemptive historical shift.
Okay, what do you mean by a redemptive historical shift?
Well, think about the history. For 1,500 years, ever since the events of Exodus chapter 12, the people of Israel have been slaughtering paschal lambs, year after year, century after century. On this specific day in Jerusalem, historians estimate that tens of thousands of lambs were being sacrificed in the temple.
Tens of thousands. That's a lot of blood.
Blood would literally be flowing out of the Temple Mount into the Kidron Valley. It was a massive operation. But the New Testament, specifically the writer of Hebrews, tells us that all of those millions of animal sacrifices over the centuries were just pedagogical shadows.
Pedagogical shadows. Let's translate that for a second for the listener. You mean they were like object lessons?
Exactly. They were teaching tools designed by God.
Yeah.
A shadow proves that a solid object is approaching.
Right.
Those animal sacrifices temporarily shielded the Hebrew firstborn in Egypt from the angel of death, but they couldn't actually cleanse the human conscience. They couldn't actually remove the guilt of human sin before a holy God.
Yeah.
They were always pointing forward.
They were pointing to the substance.
Exactly.
And now, on this specific night in AD 30 or 33, the true paschal lamb, the one the prophet Isaiah wrote about in Isaiah 53, the one John the Baptist pointed to at the river and shouted, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," he is physically present in an upper room in this volatile city. The 1,500 years of shadows are finally giving way to the solid reality.
And we also have to really remember who is reading this account for the very first time.
Right, the original audience.
The Apostle John is writing this gospel much later in the first century, likely around 80, 85, or 90. His target audience consists of believers living in Asia Minor, around modern-day Turkey, places like Ephesus.
And those early readers are not sitting in comfortable, air-conditioned churches taking notes on a Sunday morning. They are bleeding. They are suffering immensely.
Tremendously. They have faced what historically was called the aposynagogues, which translates to a formal, devastating expulsion from their local synagogues.
Wow.
For a first-century Jewish believer in Jesus, being thrown out of the synagogue didn't just mean you had to find a new place to worship on the weekend. It meant you were cut off from your family, your community, your business contacts, your entire social safety net. You were socially isolated and economically ruined.
Plus, on the pagan side of things, they're facing the terrifying rise of Roman imperial persecution, especially under the Emperor Domitian, who demanded to be worshipped as a god. So these early readers of John's gospel are a vulnerable, battered, totally traumatized remnant.
Which is exactly why the message of John 13.1 would have been an absolute fortress for them.
Yeah.
When you are losing your job, your family, and maybe even your life because of your faith, the primary temptation is to believe that God has abandoned you.
Of course.
They desperately needed to know that their current suffering did not mean Christ's love for them had failed.
But I want to push back on the narrative for a second, just playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
When I read the historical account of Jesus in this volatile political with the brutal Roman war machine on one side and the corrupt, manipulative religious leaders on the other, it feels like a tragedy.
Yeah, it does look like that from the outside.
Right. If Jesus is about to be arrested in the middle of the night, subjected to kangaroo courts, and executed by these massive geopolitical forces, doesn't it just look like he's a victim of bad timing? Like, he was a well-meaning rabbi who pushed the envelope a little too far and just got swallowed up by corrupt politics.
That is actually a very common perspective today. There is a whole school of academic thought called higher critical skepticism.
Okay.
These are modern scholars who basically try to strip all the supernatural elements out of the Bible. And their primary argument is exactly what you just described. Jesus was just a failed political revolutionary. He went to Jerusalem hoping to start a peaceful reform movement. Things got way out of hand. The authorities crushed him. And his followers later invented a whole theology to explain away the disaster.
Right.
But the text of John's gospel vehemently, aggressively rejects that entire premise. Because John goes out of his way to emphasize absolute divine sovereignty. Jesus is not swept helplessly into these events. He is not a martyr to bad timing. What John is showing us is the profound mystery of compatibilism, where history and divine providence meet perfectly.
Okay, unpack compatibilism a bit.
So, yes, wicked men like Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, and Judas Iscariot are making real, responsible, deeply sinful choices to commit murder. God is not forcing them to sin. But simultaneously, behind, above, and through those wicked choices, God's eternal saving purpose is standing sovereign and immovable.
So he isn't a victim being dragged to an altar. He is a priest willingly orchestrating the sacrifice.
Precisely. Jesus is fully aware, fully in control, executing the eternal covenant of redemption that was made between the Father and the Son before time even began. In John chapter 10, Jesus explicitly says, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down on my own accord." The cross wasn't an accident. It was the ultimate target.
Man, that collision of absolute historical darkness and unyielding divine sovereignty is breathtaking. And if you pay attention, that collision actually triggers a massive structural shift in how the Gospel of John itself is put together, doesn't it? We literally transition from this huge continent-spanning public stage into a deeply private, intimate sanctuary.
The literary architecture of John's Gospel is brilliant, and really understanding it is key to understanding this verse. Biblical scholars generally divide the Gospel of John into two main halves. Chapters 1 through 12 are often called the Book of Signs.
And that covers roughly 3 years of his public ministry, right?
Exactly. For 3 years, Jesus is out in the open. He performs 7 massive, undeniable public miracles, which John calls signs. He turns water to wine. He heals a man who had been paralyzed for 38 years. He feeds 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread. He literally raises Lazarus from the dead after he had been in a tomb for 4 days.
Yeah.
He is declaring his identity to the world. But how does that public ministry end? Despite these overwhelming demonstrations of divine power, it ends in widespread, stubborn unbelief.
People still demanded more proof. I mean, have you ever felt like that? Like, God, if you just give me one more sign, if you just fix this one problem, then I'll trust you completely.
Yeah, we all do that.
But chapter 12 proves that more miracles do not cure a hardened human heart. In fact, John says the nation experienced a judicial hardening.
Yeah, let's unpack that term, judicial hardening, because it is a terrifying biblical concept. It means that when a person or a nation repeatedly, willfully suppresses the truth and rejects the light, there comes a point where God, acting as a righteous judge, essentially bangs the gavel and says, "Fine, you want the darkness. I will give you over to the darkness you have chosen."
Wow.
He removes his restraining grace, and their hearts become hardened like concrete. That is what happened to the public stage in Israel.
Chapter 12 is almost like the closing arguments in a courtroom. Jesus issues a final public warning, and then the text literally says he departed and hid himself from them. The public invitation was over.
It was over.
And then we hit chapter 13. This is the start of what scholars call the Book of Glory. And what strikes me every single time I read it is how the narrative clock just violently slows down.
It screeches to a complete halt. We go from 3 years of sweeping, fast-paced public controversy to zooming the camera lens all the way in on a single evening in a single private room with just a handful of men. John is going to spend the next 5 entire chapters, chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, detailing the conversation of just a few hours.
It's incredible. And John 13.1 is the structural gateway for everything that follows.
Yeah.
It's the grand thesis statement for the upper room discourse and the entire passion narrative. Let me read the verse so we have it fully in front of us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end.
Such a powerful verse.
And what absolutely blows my mind is what happens immediately after John writes this grand, cosmic, towering theological declaration. The very next thing Jesus does in verse 4 is he stands up from supper, takes off his outer garments, ties a towel around his waist, pours water into a basin, and starts washing the dirt off his disciples' feet.
Right. And to understand the shock of that moment, you really have to understand the culture. In a first-century household, washing the feet of guests was the job of the absolute lowest-ranking servant or slave.
Yeah.
Remember, they didn't have paved sidewalks or closed-toe shoes. They wore sandals, and they walked on dirt roads that were shared with donkeys, camels, and livestock. The roads were covered in dust, mud, and frankly, animal refuse. Feet were physically filthy and culturally considered the most dishonorable part of the body.
It was a deeply menial, degrading task. But here's my question, because I see this all the time. Today, a lot of people read that foot washing scene strictly as a nice moral lesson on etiquette. Or worse, it gets used in corporate seminars as a life hack for servant leadership.
Oh, I've seen that.
Good CEOs should serve their employees. While that's a nice thought, aren't we severely domesticating the text? Are we overcomplicating it if we tie this foot washing directly to the cross and salvation?
We aren't overcomplicating it at all. The modern corporate readings are severely undercomplicating it. Yes, on one level, it is a profound lesson in humility. Jesus even says later, I have given you an example. But fundamentally, the foot washing is an enacted exposition of John 13.1.
Meaning, he's acting out the theology of the verse.
Exactly. Jesus stripping off his outer garments and stooping to the filthy floor with a towel is a living, breathing parable of the incarnation and the crucifixion. He is illustrating what it means that he loved them to the end. The creator of the universe is visually demonstrating how he is about to stoop beneath the horrifying weight of divine judgment at Calvary to wash away the moral filth of his people.
Which perfectly explains why Peter reacts the way he does. Peter absolutely hates this. He recoils in total horror. When Jesus gets to him, Peter says, "You shall never wash my feet."
Yeah, he's appalled.
And I get it. It's like the extreme ancient equivalent of the modern awkwardness. When you go out to dinner with a friend and they try to pay the bill and you get into that weird fight over the check because your pride won't let them treat you.
That is a great analogy.
Magnify that feeling by 1,000,000 and you have Peter's spiritual pride.
Peter's resistance exposes the great scandal of grace. Human pride hates grace. We naturally want a religion where we retain some shred of dignity, some basis for boasting. We want to clean ourselves up, pay our own moral bill, and present ourselves to God as respectable partners.
Right.
But Jesus completely shatters that. He tells Peter, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me.
That is such a devastating line.
It is, because it proves that the sinner is totally, utterly incapable of cleansing themselves. You cannot pay the bill. If you want a relationship with a holy God, you have to endure the humiliation of letting him do all the saving. The master has to take the place of the servant, and ultimately the place of the substitute on the cross. The blood of Christ is the only detergent that can wash a human soul.
That is incredibly powerful. But honestly, I think we haven't even hit the most staggering part of this scene yet. It is not just what Jesus does in that room that is so amazing, but what he knows as he is doing it.
Yes, exactly.
Let's look back at the text. John uses this very specific Greek perfect active participle, eidos, which translates to knowing. The text says, when Jesus knew that his hour had come. Let's stop right there. What is the hour?
So the motif of the hour is this dramatic thread that John weaves throughout his entire gospel. Several times in the earlier chapters, Jesus is teaching, and the religious leaders get so angry they try to arrest him or stone him on the spot. But John writes, they could not lay a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. There was this invisible, divine restraint protecting him.
It's like an alarm clock set by the Father before the foundation of the world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But now, in John 13, the alarm has gone off. The clock has struck midnight. The invisible restraint is lifted. The hour of his ultimate suffering, substitutionary death, and subsequent glorification has officially arrived. And the psychological burden of that omniscience, the burden of eidos, of knowing, is utterly terrifying.
Because we have to ask ourselves, What exactly did he know in that room? He wasn't washing their feet based on some naive, optimistic misreading of their characters.
No, not at all.
He wasn't looking at these 12 guys and thinking, man, I have invested 3 years into these fellows. They are the best of the best. They are really going to have my back tonight. No. He knew.
He possessed perfect, unvarnished foresight.
He knew that Judas was sitting right there, his feet wet from the basin, actively calculating the exchange rate for 30 pieces of silver to betray him. He knew that Peter, the one pledging his undying loyalty, was going to deny him with profanity and curses in just a few short hours. He knew that every single one of these men he loved so much was going to scatter into the dark to save their own skin, leaving him completely alone.
And his omniscience went far beyond just the failure of his friends. He saw the physical torment coming. He saw the Roman flagrum, the brutal leather whip woven with pieces of bone and lead that was designed to flay the skin and muscle off a human back.
Brutal.
He foresaw the agonizing suffocation of the cross. But most terrifyingly of all, far worse than the nails or the whip, he saw the infinite burning cup of the Father's righteous wrath against human sin. He knew the exact eternal weight of the spiritual judgment he was about to absorb.
I want to camp out on this for a second because this completely inverts how human beings operate.
Yeah.
Normally, if we have advanced knowledge that a relationship is going to end in total painful betrayal, we build defensive walls.
Yeah.
It is like co-signing a massive mortgage with a business partner when you have absolute time-traveling proof that they are going to bankrupt the company and skip town tomorrow.
You'd never do it.
No sane human being would ever do that.
Yeah.
Human omniscience would freeze compassion. We would look at the future, see the pain, and say, I am not investing another second in you.
We would protect ourselves.
Exactly. But Christ's omniscience makes his compassion astonishing because he sees the betrayal, he sees the cowardice, he sees the cross, and instead of backing away, he leans in, he grabs the towel. He loves them anyway.
This reality raises a deeply important theological question about the psychological and spiritual agony of the Redeemer. A lot of people, without realizing it, view Jesus approaching the cross like he was Superman immune to real fear, just stoically acting out a script.
Right, like it didn't really hurt him emotionally.
Exactly. But great theologians like B.B. Warfield and the Puritan John Owen have written profoundly on this to correct that error. Christ was not a stoic robot. As a true human being, he experienced profound, sinless mental and spiritual anguish.
We see that in the Garden of Gethsemane, right, where he is sweating drops of blood.
Yes. The medical term is hematidrosis, which is caused by extreme, overwhelming psychological distress. You see, on the cross, the cumulative weight of God's just judgment against the sins of all his people across all of time was being funneled into a single human soul.
It's unfathomable.
For a finite period of hours, Jesus lost the conscious enjoyment of his Father's favorable presence. He was plunged into absolute spiritual darkness, which is why he cried out the words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
He drank the terrifying cup of divine abandonment so that you and I, listening today, would only ever have to drink the cup of adoption. We will never know what it is like to be truly forsaken by God because he took that exact forsakenness for us.
Yeah.
But that forces a massive question. Why? Because he knew exactly how weak, sinful, and treacherous these men were. Who exactly are these people that he would willingly endure this nightmare for them?
And the text doesn't leave us guessing.
Right. It zeroes in on a very specific phrase. John uses the aorist active participle agapesis, having loved, and the object of that love is to sanus idios, which translates to his own, having loved his own.
That phrase, tu charis idios, is a critical theological anchor. If we look at how the word idios is used in classical Greek and in ancient papyri documents, it specifically refers to private property. It means your personal family, your private estate, the things that belong exclusively to you.
Wow.
It is the language of profound possession. And this completely reshapes how we are supposed to understand the love of God. John is not talking here about a vague, generic, universal benevolence that just floats out into the ether hoping someone somewhere happens to catch it. This is particular, covenantal, sacerdotal ownership.
Okay, wait, let's define that word because we promised to avoid dropping heavy seminary jargon without explaining it. Sacerdotal. That comes from the Latin word for priest, right?
Exactly right. A priest is a representative. When a high priest in the Old Testament went into the Holy of Holies, he wore a breastpiece with 12 stones on it, each representing a specific tribe of Israel. He wasn't representing the whole globe. He was representing God's specific covenant people.
Okay, I track with that.
So when we say Christ has a sacerdotal ownership of his own, we mean he is acting as their great high priest. They belong to him by eternal election, meaning they were given to him by the Father before time began, and they are about to belong to him by the right of redemption, purchased with his own blood. This is the historic Protestant doctrine of definite atonement. He is laying down his life specifically and intentionally to save his sheep.
Okay, I have to stop you there because I can hear the modern listener's brain cringing just a little bit.
I'm sure.
In today's cultural climate, words like exclusive, particular, or definite sound incredibly offensive. They sound, well, mean. Today, everyone wants a universal blanket love that applies to everyone equally, without any distinction whatsoever. Doesn't saying Jesus specifically loved his own sound uncomfortably restrictive? Like God is just playing favorites. How is that supposed to be comforting?
I completely understand why it sounds offensive to the modern democratic ear. But if you actually think it through, this particular love is the absolute bedrock foundation of your comfort and security as a believer. Think about the alternative. If Christ's love on the cross were merely a universal wish, a broad sentiment that applies equally to every single human being in history, but actually guarantees the salvation of absolutely no one in particular, it would be a powerless love.
It would be a love that says, I paid the price, I did my part, now I really hope you figure out how to be good enough to accept it.
Exactly. It would be a love that tries to save but frequently fails. But the distinction between true disciples and Judas, right there in the upper room, proves that isn't the case. Judas is in the room. He is experiencing the physical proximity of Jesus. He's eating the same bread. But Jesus specifically says to the group, not all of you are clean.
Right.
Judas departs into the night. He perishes in his sin. The reason that the true disciples survived their massive moral failures later that night is precisely because Christ's love for them is particular.
Because they belong to him in a way Judas didn't?
Yes, it is a guaranteed fortress. He is the great shepherd who knows his sheep by name. If you belong to him, you are not a temporary client. You are a treasured, blood-bought possession.
Which means there is no limit to how far he will go to keep what is his. You don't abandon your most treasured possession when things get difficult. And that leads us directly to the climax of the verse. The main independent clause in the Greek is telos agapaizen autos. He loved them to the end.
The semantic range of that little phrase, "his telos," is incredibly rich and dense. It is operating on two distinct levels simultaneously. Temporally, as in relation to time, it means he loved them to the very end of his earthly life, all the way to his final agonizing breath on the cross. He didn't quit halfway through.
Right.
But qualitatively, as in relation to intensity, it means he loved them to the absolute uttermost limit of redemptive capacity. He left nothing undone. He exhausted the reserves of divine love.
He didn't just love them akritinos, which would be the Greek phrase for until a certain point. He didn't draw a line in the sand and say, I'll love you and teach you until the trial starts, but once the whips come out, you guys are on your own. He went all the way to the bottom.
And we have to be crystal clear about what that uttermost love actually looks like, because we have really distorted the definition of love today. The cross is the climax of this love. But biblically speaking, love is not demonstrated by God just waving his hand and relaxing his justice.
Let's use a modern courtroom analogy here. If a judge has a criminal in front of him who has robbed a bank and hurt people, and the judge just says, you know what, I'm a loving guy, I forgive you, you're free to go without any penalty, we wouldn't call that judge loving.
No, not at all.
We would call him corrupt. We would demand he be removed from the bench because he is turning a blind eye to evil and injustice.
That is a perfect analogy. A just judge cannot simply dismiss a crime. The penalty must be paid for justice to be satisfied. And God is the infinitely just judge of the universe. He cannot simply ignore human rebellion and sin. True holy love is demonstrated by satisfying that justice, not subverting it.
And this is the core mechanism of what theologians call penal substitution.
Yes. Penal, referring to the penalty of the law, and substitution, referring to Christ taking our place. Isaiah 53:6 lays out the mechanism perfectly. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
That's it right there.
The incarnate Son of God acts as the covenant representative. He willingly steps into the dock of the courtroom, he stands in the place of his guilty people, and he physically and spiritually absorbs the curse of the law that they deserved. The punishment for sin is fully, exhaustively executed, but it falls on the substitute instead of the sinner. The fine is paid in full.
You know, I am reminded of a quote I have here. Let me find it. Yeah, by the great 19th century preacher Charles Spurgeon, that just captures the sheer magnitude of this. Spurgeon was reflecting on this idea of Christ's unending love, and he wrote, "Loving Christ is not a light that flickers in the wind, nor a flame that burns out when the fuel is spent. It is an eternal fire kindled from the essence of God himself. He loved you before the stars were flung into the vault of heaven. He loved you when he hung bleeding upon the accursed tree. He loves you today amid all your backslidings and sorrows, and he will love you when time shall be no more."
I love that quote. It is an immovable trajectory. Nothing can deflect it.
And this profound doctrine of an uttermost substitutionary, unfailing love, it doesn't just sit in a vacuum as some high-level academic thought for theologians to debate in the classroom. It actually acts as a massive wrecking ball to some of the most common topic theological misunderstandings we carry around today. We need to set up some theological guardrails here based on this text. For instance, right in the middle of John 13.1, the text says Jesus was departing to the Father.
That tiny phrase is absolutely vital for understanding Trinitarian harmony.
Let's dive into that, because there is this very popular, almost unspoken caricature in modern Christianity. It's how a lot of us practically view God, even if we know better on paper.
Oh, absolutely.
People imagine that God the Father is this perpetually angry, wrathful, strict deity up in heaven who is just looking for a reason to crush us with a lightning bolt. And Jesus is the gentle, compassionate, loving son who steps in front of the Father and says, "Please, Dad, don't hurt them. I'll take the hit." How does this text and the reality of the cross completely correct that abusive father narrative?
That caricature is a functional denial of the Trinity, and honestly, it is spiritually damaging.
Yeah.
The Father and the Son are not ontologically divided at Calvary.
Ontologically divided, meaning they don't have two different natures or two different wills.
Right. They share one divine essence, one will, and one purpose. They are not playing a cosmic game of good cop, bad cop. Notice the text says, Jesus is departing to the Father. It was the Father who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. It is the Son who willingly and joyfully obeys the Father's command to save the elect. The cross is not Jesus changing the Father's mind about you. The cross is the exact, perfect revelation of the Father's heart toward you. When you see the gentleness and lowliness of Christ absorbing wrath for sinners, you are seeing the very heart of the Father on full display. They act in one perfectly unified, saving purpose.
That is so freeing, to know that the Father loves you just as intensely as the Son does. And there are other modern errors this text just systematically dismantles. If we look at the whole system of Arminianism or any form of everyday legalism that says you basically have to earn your keep.
Right.
You know, the idea that God saved you, but now it is entirely up to you to maintain your own salvation by your good works, your discipline, or your endurance. This text says absolutely not. You cannot fall from this grace because your salvation isn't maintained by your frail grip on Christ. It is maintained by the mediator's immutable grip on you. He loves you to the end.
And it equally refutes the prosperity gospel, which is rampant today.
Right, because the text specifically says he loved his own who were in the world. And in John's gospel, the world isn't just the globe. It represents a hostile, broken, dangerous system that is opposed to God. Jesus' greatest act of love didn't bypass suffering. It didn't give the disciples immediate health, wealth, and a stress-free life. His love led him and them through the deepest suffering and death imaginable.
If the prosperity gospel were true, if God's love always meant material blessing and physical health, then the cross would make zero sense. Jesus was perfectly loved by the Father, yet he died in agony, stripped of everything. The love of God does not exempt us from pain in this life. What it does is guarantee that our pain is never punitive and that it can never, ever separate us from him.
And on the flip side of the legalism coin, this text completely crushes antinomianism.
Let's define that for the listener real quick. Anti meaning against, nomos meaning law.
It is the idea of cheap grace. It's the attitude that says, hey, God's love is unconditional, Jesus paid it all, so I can just live however I want. I can indulge in secret sin, I can be greedy, I can be arrogant because I'm forgiven anyway. Why does John 13 destroy that mindset?
Because a true spiritual realization of this is, telos love doesn't make you want to sin more, it breaks you. When you actually personally taste a love that went to the uttermost depths of hell to rescue you when you were actively taking his enemy, it melts the hard, rebellious heart. It slays the love of sin.
Right.
True grace doesn't produce apathy. It constrains the believer to grateful, radical obedience. You want to serve others, you want to wash others' feet because your soul was washed with his blood. If you think you can use grace as a license to sin, you haven't actually understood the cross.
So let's bring this all down to the ground. What does this actually mean for you, the listener? We've talked about first century Roman occupation, Greek participles, and heavy theological concepts. But how does a 2,000-year-old text about a Passover meal in Jerusalem change your Tuesday morning commute? Or how you deal with your kids, or how you sleep at night?
It changes everything by applying the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints directly to your daily life and viewing it entirely from the side of Christ's fidelity, not yours.
Let's speak directly to the listener who feels like they are failing right now. Maybe you are that sinning, weak, exhausted believer. You are heavily burdened by your own indwelling sin. You look at your track record this past month, and Satan is whispering in your ear, making a very logical-sounding argument that your repeated failures have finally alienated you from Christ.
Yeah.
That you've crossed the invisible line, the grace account is overdrawn, and God is fundamentally disgusted with you.
To that specific listener, I want you to look at who Jesus is loving in this upper room. He is loving men who are literally hours away from sleeping through his greatest agony in the garden, abandoning him to the temple guards, and denying they even know his name to a servant girl. Christ did not set his love on some idealized, perfectly sanctified future version of you.
No, he didn't.
He didn't love a hypothetical you. He knew exhaustively every sin you would ever commit, every time you would choose a cheap idol over him, every time you would lose your temper, and he went to the cross anyway.
His gentleness toward you is not conditional on your beauty or your performance. So when you stumble, you do not need to hide like Adam and Eve in the garden. You don't need to do penance to earn your way back into his good graces. You confess quickly. You run directly to him because, as the Apostle Paul declares in Romans 8:1, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The verdict has already been handed down, and the entire weight of it fell on him.
But we also need to address the listener who is suffering heavily right now. The one going through severe, inexplicable affliction. Maybe it is a chronic illness that won't heal, sudden financial ruin, deep, suffocating depression, or the tragic loss of a loved one. The immediate human temptation is to look at your circumstances through what we might call carnal eyes, just human logic, and think, God is punishing me, God is angry with me, I must have done something wrong to deserve this.
But John 13 tells us we have to do the exact opposite. We must interpret our suffering through the lens of the cross. We cannot interpret Christ's heart through our affliction. If he loved you enough to endure the unmitigated, infinite wrath of God for your eternal soul, he hasn't suddenly turned against you because you lost your job.
The hardship you are facing is not a reopened criminal verdict. Christ absorbed all the punishment for your sins. God is not double charging you. What you're experiencing, while painful, is the fatherly discipline and sovereign providence of a God who is refining you for holiness. As Paul says in Romans 8, tribulation, distress, persecution, and famine cannot separate you from the love of God. They are actually tools in his hand to conform you to the image of his Son.
And finally, to be faithful to the text, we have to issue a brief but incredibly solemn warning based on the tragic figure of Judas Iscariot. There might be someone listening right now who is always around the things of God but doesn't actually know him.
Yes, this is so important.
You have external closeness to the church. Maybe you know the theological vocabulary, you attend the services, you listen to deep dives like this one, you have a solid Christian heritage. But Judas had all of that. Judas had the best theological education in human history. He sat at the very table. He saw the miracles. But external proximity does not save you.
It is a terrifying reality. You can have your feet washed by Jesus and still go to hell if your heart is never washed by his blood. But the beauty of the gospel is that it offers a gentle and lowly Savior to you right now, today. Jesus promises in John chapter 6, "Whoever comes to me, I will never cast out." If you're outside of Christ, if you are relying on your own goodness, drop the self-righteousness. Drop the pretense. Come empty-handed to the one who offers this unfailing, particular, uttermost love.
Okay, we have covered massive ground today. We started in the explosive political tension and the typological shadows of the Passover in first century Jerusalem. We watched the narrative violently slow down, zooming into the private sanctuary of the upper room to see the creator of the universe stripped down to a towel and a basin to wash filthy feet.
We did.
We looked at the terrifying omniscience of a Savior who knew every betrayal, every denial, and the infinite crushing wrath he was about to face.
And yet, because of his particular covenantal possession of his people, because they were his own, he moved forward into the darkness. He loved them, and he loved them is telos to the absolute uttermost limit of substitutionary sacrifice.
The ultimate takeaway for your daily life is this. Our security, our peace, our assurance does not rest on our fragile, inconsistent ability to hold on to him. It rests entirely on the immutable, unfailing heart of the mediator holding on to us.
The Savior is faithful even when we are faithless, for he cannot deny himself.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought, a challenge for you to mull over as you go about your week, whether you are at the office or at the dinner table or lying awake at night. Later in this very same chapter, in John 13:34, Jesus commands his disciples, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." If you truly internalize what we talked about today, if you believe that Christ loved you is telos, to the absolute uttermost, even when he possessed exhaustive knowledge of every betrayal, every failure, and every rebellion you would ever commit against him, how does that violently upend the way you are treating the person in your life who has wronged you the most?
That is the inescapable corrosion of the Christian life.
You cannot joyfully receive an ease telos love from God, a love that pays your infinite debt, and then turn around and hand out a conditional, fragile, transactional love to your neighbor. You cannot hold on to bitterness when you have been bathed in grace. Think about that reality this week. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unfailing heart of Christ. We'll see you next time.